Great. All right. Thanks everybody for taking a midday moment to be with us today. Really appreciate that. And again, my name is Chris Manganiello. I'm the Water Policy Director for Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. And today I'll be talking about kind of a perennial topic here in Georgia that we've been talking about for many, many years called the water wars. Just a first kind of quick, there we go. Just the first quick, who and what is Chattahoochee Riverkeeper? For those of us for those of you who may not know who we are, we're an organization that was established in 1994, the only organization that's dedicated to looking and watching over the Chattahoochee River. Our mission is to advocate and secure the protection and stewardship of the Chattahoochee River, its lakes, tributaries, watershed, and whatnot, all in order to restore and conserve the ecological health for the people and the wildlife that depend on the river system. Another short way of thinking about it is we work really hard to make sure that there's clean water in the Chattahoochee and that it's available and there's plenty of it for all the people and the needs, be they human needs and also like fish needs and other aquatic needs. Chattahoochee Riverkeeper is the 11th licensed waterkeeper, was the 11th licensed waterkeeper in the United States. Waterkeeper is an international organization. There are riverkeepers all over Georgia, all over the country, all over the world. CRK was the 11th. There are now over 300 different waterkeepers, riverkeepers, baykeepers, whatnot, all over the world. We have about 10,000 members here, and with offices headquartered in Atlanta, as well as an office in Gainesville, right near Lake Lanier, and another in LaGrange near West Point Lake. What do we do? We're a nonprofit. We focus on advocacy. We spend a lot of time, kind of the picture on the left there, we have a neighborhood water watch program. We have volunteers to go out and collect water samples and help us find sewer leaks like this one. We have an education program. You can kind of see a picture there in the middle. We get young kids out on Lake Lanier and West Point Lake. We have 2 large pontoon boats that we use as floating classrooms. So we get kids out on the water, teach them about the water cycle, where their water comes from, help them understand, what makes water clean and what can contribute to pollution. We also do advocacy work. On the far right there is a picture of us working in the General Assembly at the Capitol. And so we do work with legislators and agency level, work as well to protect the water and other natural resources here in Georgia. So that's us as an organization. But what I'm going to, again, talk to you about here today is the water wars and ultimately why our future has to be different, and why we have to think about different ways to make sure that the Chattahoochee River will be more sustainable and resilient, and what that means for water supply. These are some pictures. On the left there, you see some newspaper clippings. The one there about streetcar service, this took place during the drought in 1925, which was one of the worst droughts to hit the state. Streetcar service got cut in the city of Atlanta. Then in 1954, another major drought hit and they had to close schools. This one is a picture of a school in Fayetteville down in Georgia. And then we also, in 2012 and 2000, more recently, this is a picture of, please water your grass. Kind of reminding folks in the suburbs in the middle of a drought that they should be also thinking about watering their grass. And then on the far right there is a picture of, down in South Georgia, agriculture irrigation has kind of a reputation as not being effective and spraying on the roads. And this is a sign just warning people of that. Certainly, these events and some of these realities have inspired a lot of beneficial change. We've made a lot of improvements in terms of water conservation efficiency, both in Metro Atlanta as well as in agricultural applications. But we also know there are a lot more opportunities out there for Metro Atlanta and the rest of Georgia. And I would argue we don't really have a choice if we want to avoid future water wars. So we have to do all these things for the Chattahoochee River's sustainability. So with all of these things in mind, it's important if we kind of just think about the Chattahoochee here. You'll see in blue, in light blue, this is the Chattahoochee River Basin. The headwaters of the Chattahoochee up near Helen at the top of the map there. The headwaters of the Chattahoochee River above Atlanta comprise the smallest watershed or drainage area for any major metropolitan area in the country. Again, the basin, which is all in blue here, is about 8,000 square miles, arguably is one of the hardest working water resources in the state of Georgia. The river basin stretches from Helen there in the headwaters all the way down through Atlanta. The river runs through Atlanta, all the metropolitan uses there, runs on down through Columbus, and then down through kind of the agricultural heartland of Georgia there in the southern part of our river basin, and connects down there with the Flint River and Lake Seminole. So, just kind of got these other uses here as well to think about. The river itself supports over 5 million people. There are over 100 wastewater plants that discharge into the river. There are 11 dams, 9 of which produce electricity, natural gas plants, coal-powered, nuclear-powered plants, as I said, agriculture, and then, of course, recreation with paddling, whitewater, boating on Lakes Lanier and West Point, cold water, trout, shoal bass. Our use and how we treat the river is very important. So resiliency planning is really critical. Another, aside from kind of all these specific reasons and uses within the Chattahoochee itself, the river is also important because, it flows these 430 miles from the headwaters down to the confluence with the Flint River in Lake Seminole down there at the Florida line. That's important too because our river is a part of a much larger system. The Flint River is there kind of highlighted in the brown areas, the Flint River Basin. The Chattahoochee and the Flint, as I said, come together at Lake Seminole and ultimately flow into what's called the Apalachicola River, which is the basin there in green. So it's important to understand that all these uses I've got written here and the things I've talked about, our water use decisions in Georgia matter for the rest of the ACF basin. And that's arguably why we've also been involved in this kind of cross-boundary fight for many years, right? So I want to kind of spend the rest of the time talking now about how we kind of got into the water wars and where we are today. I think that we often kind of simplify the water wars to something about, it's a conflict over water use in metropolitan Atlanta, and it's about oysters and endangered species in Florida. And, it's much more complicated than that, like most things in the world. And it involves agriculture, it involves land use, it involves energy choices, and obviously it also involves water quality. So I kind of want to talk through some of those things as well as just offer that there are some solutions outside of the courtroom that I think we can also look to. So first, how did we get here? Where did this start? Back in the 1980s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is the federal agency responsible for managing Lake Lanier, began allowing communities to take more water out of Lake Lanier, which is pictured here. That's kind of Buford Dam in the foreground on the bottom of the picture, and Lake Lanier backing up behind it, backing up in the Chattahoochee River headwaters. So Lake Lanier became more of a primary drinking water source for Metro Atlanta. Alabama and Florida started to take notice and began to argue that Georgia was withdrawing too much water from Lake Lanier and using too much from the Chattahoochee River, and that it wasn't sharing that water fairly. Eventually, Alabama and Florida would sue Metro Atlanta, sue Georgia over Metro Atlanta's use. This is what really ultimately triggered the water wars when the Army Corps began allocating Lake Lanier for water supply back in 1990. So this kind of started off the conflict. By 1998, there was an attempt at a negotiated settlement, and Congress would ratify an ACF River Basin Compact. The Tri-State ACF Commission was really created and tasked with, figuring out a equitable way to kind of, divvy up the waters in the ACF Basin in a way that would be, equitable and for all 3 states. The goal, again, was to kind of figuring out this way to cut up the water for our three states. The negotiations would be expanded over 14 different times over those 5 years or so before the compact eventually expired. And Alabama and Georgia were, they wanted to they proposed to extend the compact, but Florida ultimately was not interested and refused to agree, and this whole process didn't produce a solution, and so the litigation would continue. And so the states, the courts, the Army Corps would really debate for the next decade or so what the definition of water supply was. And in 2009, so I should take a step back. All the Army Corps' major projects like Lake Lanier, West Point, Lake Seminole, all of these projects, when they were constructed, in the 1950s all the way up to the 1980s, when they were built for specific authorized purposes. The big ones were to generate hydropower. Most of these dams can generate electricity. They were built for flood control. And they were built to enhance or improve navigation. And so that's why this question of, was Lake Lanier specifically authorized for water supply became such a big legal question. And in 2009, a federal judge ruled that actually water supply was not an authorized purpose for Lake Lanier. The judge said Georgia had 3 years to basically reach a water sharing agreement with Alabama and Florida and move on from there. But that never happened because that decision was reversed by another court that said that water supply was indeed an authorized purpose, like hydropower, navigation, and flood control for Lake Lanier. And the courts said that the Army Corps had a year to kind of figure out how much would be available for water supply purposes. And then by 2012 and 2017, the Corps kind of worked through that and ultimately would update its water control manual, recognizing that water supply was an authorized purpose and use of water for Lake Lanier. So at that point, that kind of was tilting the legal kind of favor in Georgia's direction. And then in 2012, there was a pretty significant drought, particularly in the southern portion of the ACF basin. And Florida's oyster industry faced some hard times in 2012. So in 2013, Florida, kind of thinking that they had exhausted all their other legal remedies, approached the U.S. Supreme Court and said, we think Georgia's water use is unreasonable. They're using too much water, and we want the U.S. Supreme Court to help us figure out how much water Florida should be getting. And it's important to understand, like when when one state decides they're going to sue another state, the only legal venue for that is the Supreme Court. So that is why this case was elevated all the way up to the Supreme Court. 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court said, yes, Florida will accept your challenge. For folks who like to read a lot, the link here in the PowerPoint, which will be shared with folks after the presentation, that link will take you to all the documentation involved in this particular court case. And if you're still at home looking for something to do, that'll keep you awake for many hours. So the court agreed in 2013-14 to move on with the case. They eventually appointed this individual called a special master. And the special master was tasked with kind of running the day-to-day operations, collecting evidence, taking testimony, and managing the case on a day-to-day basis. The Supreme Court doesn't have the bandwidth to do that, so they farm it out to a special master in big cases like this. And then the expectation was that the special master would make a recommendation. So the special master in 2016 began an actual trial that met over the course of 6 weeks in Maine. Again, Florida's argument here is that they're asking the Supreme Court to impose a cap limiting Georgia's consumptive water use in the Chattahoochee and Flint River Basin and to kind of help come up with an equitable apportionment for for both states. Again, the real crux of this was that it was Georgia's consumption of water in Metro Atlanta, as well as mismanagement agricultural water withdrawals that were responsible for kind of contributing to the decline of the oyster fisheries in Florida. It is true that Florida's oyster industry has crashed. A lot of that has to do with higher salt concentrations. If there's not enough fresh water from the Apalachicola River flowing into the bay, that's not a good set of conditions for oysters. They're very sensitive to kind of salinity in water, and so they need kind of just the right mix of fresh water and salinity. And in 2012 in particular, that was a problem of not enough fresh water. And at the same time, Florida had opened up its oyster beds. They had a series of kind of fishing regulations that they rolled back. They were concerned that the BP oil spill, that the kind of consequences of that were going to ultimately cause a problem in the oyster beds in Florida. So Florida kind of allowed folks to just go out and harvest the oysters. So kind of this was all part of the larger discussion during the special master's trial in 2016. He took all this testimony. Chattahoochee Riverkeeper had the opportunity to send staff. We were able to observe different parts of this 6-week trial. I ended up being there on the last couple of days, just by happenstance, because of how it worked for who was going when. So the trial wrapped up in December, and then a few months later in February, the special master offered a recommendation for what the special master thought the full U.S. Supreme Court should do. Special master said, look, I don't think Florida has proven by clear and convincing evidence that any kind of decree imposing a cap on Georgia's consumptive water use would really result in additional stream flow into Florida. And really kind of one of the big reasons is that because of the Army Corps of Engineers and all their operations at Lake Lanier, West Point, and Lake Seminole, the special master was in this position where he didn't think he could set up a decree of equitable apportionment, because it was really the Corps that was going to be ultimately responsible for kind of pushing the buttons and pulling the levers to release water further downstream. So in other words, Special Master said, look, even if I could somehow get more water into the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers, I can't guarantee it's going to get to Florida because someone else controls all the buttons and the levers. On the one hand, this looked like a good recommendation for the state of Georgia, that the special master didn't think that Florida had clear and convincing evidence. On the other hand, there were elements of the special master's findings that suggested that there was poor management of agricultural irrigation in the Chattahoochee and Flint river basins in Georgia, and that there were probably some things that could be fixed there. And the special master also did recognize, indeed, that there were a lack of freshwater flow into Florida also had negative consequences for the oyster fisheries. So again, this recommendation was certainly leaning in Georgia's direction, and we would wait until January 2018 when this case was heard by the entire panel of the Supreme Court justices in Washington, D.C. Again, folks from Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, we got to go watch the trial in person in the Supreme Court, which is a pretty fabulous experience. There was about a 90-minute oral hearing. Florida again challenged Georgia's alleged overconsumption of water. The justices, sharply questioned Florida and Georgia, really trying to figure out, what could the court do to provide relief to Florida without crippling Georgia? And different justices, again, would ask this question of, would a consumption cap in Georgia really end up sending more water down into Florida? The logical answer to that question is yes, but as I was saying, it's hard to get that water actually into Florida if the Army Corps of Engineers isn't sending it down. And the Corps of Engineers, again, they have their own operating procedures for how they release water and when they release water. So without the Army Corps really being involved in the case, it would be difficult for the special master or the Supreme Court to order the Corps to do anything. So even though the Corps wasn't technically a part of the case, they were asked to weigh in. They said, look, we have all these administrative procedures. We can't guarantee, without going through a long public review, public process of revising our water control manuals, we could try to facilitate moving more water down, but it would take a whole nother kind of administrative process and environmental impact statements and kind of a long drawn out process for the Corps to implement any kind of order that anybody would, the Supreme Court level would offer. Now, Florida had hoped that this was this kind of acknowledgement from the Corps that they would do what they could to help. Florida hoped this statement was enough to encourage the court to issue a decision that would limit Georgia's water use, under the assumption that the Corps could change its operations to ensure that more water would make it down to Apalachicola. And really, what the court ultimately ended up, issuing in June 2018, in their opinion, certainly did to some degree would make Florida happy and Georgia not so happy. Based on the based on the special master's report and the evidence presented to the full Supreme Court, the majority of the justices did agree that Florida has likely suffered some harm due to decreased flow, that Florida has demonstrated that Georgia has taken too much water, that Georgia's water use may have injured Florida, but the court needs more information to determine if this is all. And so the court believed that a cap would likely lead to an increased stream flow and that extra water may redress economic and ecological harm. But as you'll notice, these statements, likely, may, would likely, they weren't definitive from the Supreme Court's decision, or from their opinion. So, so while the majority of the justices agreed that Florida had made a legally sufficient case, they were also saying, look, the only thing we can do is, if, Florida will only get what it thinks it can demonstrate, the benefits will substantially outweigh the harm to Georgia. In other words, the court was saying, we think Florida has made a sufficient case, but what this is all going to hinge on is whether or not Florida can demonstrate that any benefit to Florida is not going to be negative or have negative consequences on Georgia. And so because they were kind of unsure with this language, likely, may, would likely, and they needed more data, they basically sent the case back to another special master. The first special master, who was based in Maine, was replaced with another special master who's a federal judge from New Mexico, Judge Paul Kelly. And Judge Kelly at the helm in late 2018, he started managing the case on a day-to-day basis. There were questions back and forth between the two states, Florida and Georgia, about whether or not additional fact-finding would take place. Ultimately, the decision was no. There would be no additional fact-finding. There was question about whether or not there could be continued mediation. Florida said no, not necessarily. Georgia didn't think Florida was taking mediations seriously, in their opinion. And then finally, there was a question about whether or not the Corps had anything that could be added to the conversation. And that really kind of ultimately came down of the Corps has not been involved in the case directly. They're not a party, they're not legally a party to the case, and that they have made earlier statements about doing their best to accommodate any court order, but that their operations are constrained by all sorts of federal statutes and requirements. And so the case kind of ground on through 2018 and 19, which brings us closer to the present. Again, we kind of went to Maine and New Mexico to Washington, and now we're going back to Washington eventually. But this brings us really closer to the present. And their special master, the second one, special master, held a hearing in November in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where again it was about an hour and a half hearing, and kind of the key question that the special master asked of Florida was, how much, or how would Florida benefit from additional stream flow? and how would that benefit not harm Georgia? In the hour and a half of the testimony, the special master asked a handful of questions, not a whole lot, allowed both parties to kind of take up most of the oxygen in the room, which was to some degree kind of indicative, I think, of the important questions that the special master had. And one of them really was this question of, what benefit to Florida will work in such a way to not harm Georgia. So Florida explained that there were a number of remedies that Georgia had offered Florida in previous negotiations. For folks in the headwaters, the Chattahoochee Glades Reservoir was something that apparently in the mid-2000s, Georgia had gone to Florida and said, look, we'll build Glades Reservoir, we'll build aquifer storage and recovery projects in the Flint River Basin. We'll do all these kind of water supply projects in Georgia so that we can deliver Florida, a few thousand CFS at the Florida line. So Florida was arguing in the case that, if Georgia thought those were reasonable and economically viable solutions in the past, that wouldn't they be, viable and economically reasonable today? Not that we necessarily agree with all those particular examples of potential projects, but that was Florida's kind of basic argument before the special master. The special master also asked Georgia, while acknowledging that Georgia had made strides in water conservation and efficiency in Metro Atlanta, and kind of recognizing the investment in the Water Stewardship Act of 2010 and the Flint River Drought Protection Act. The special master kind of recognized all these things that Georgia did to make sure that make sure that Georgia's use was reasonable. The special master did ask the question of Georgia, at what point will it become unreasonable? Up until this point, Georgia's been making the argument, look, our population is growing, our economy is growing, we need all this water for now and for the future. So to a certain degree, the special master was kind of turning that on its head and saying, like, well, if you really are going to be growing in all these different ways, at what point in the future might Georgia's water use become unreasonable? Georgia's attorney essentially said, it's not really a concern we need to worry about. We don't think that's going to be a problem in the foreseeable future. And if the use ever became unreasonable, the state would, assess stream flows at that time. And that was pretty much the answer and the end of that line of questioning. The trial wrapped up, and a month later in December, we had another recommendation from the special master. In plain terms, Special Master Judge Kelly basically recommended that the U.S. Supreme Court drop Florida's case. Kelly thought that Florida failed to meet its burden of proof to show, to show clear and convincing evidence that Georgia uses too much water, and that any harm to Florida's oyster population could be traced to water use in Georgia. So, in many ways, the special master said this very similar thing to the first special master, saying Florida doesn't really have a case here. I think it's important to point out that while the special master did side so strongly with Georgia, it was probably more indicative of Florida's failures to present sound scientific support for its arguments, rather than a sign that Georgia's evidence and data were 100% accurate or infallible. The special master's recommendation comes down pretty hard on Florida and Florida's evidence and their experts, and certainly places a lot more strength and credibility in the information provided by Georgia's experts and their data. Kind of despite this kind of, again, tipping the favor in Georgia's court, the special master in this case as well acknowledged that low flows and increased salinity have the ability to negatively affect Florida's oysters. But again, these weren't the only things that were responsible for the fisheries challenge. Reduced stream flows due to drought, potential overharvest due to the BP oil spill. The special master goes on to say that these things probably also influenced the fate of the fisheries. But kind of on this point of reduced stream flows, which again was our first special master, Florida had the opportunity to respond and in April responded to the special master in what's called an exceptions brief. And they kind of Florida dug deep into the record to demonstrate why Florida is entitled to relief and that Georgia's water use is unreasonable. For example, when it came to the oyster evidence, Florida decided to set up a kind of local knowledge versus outside knowledge to argue that the special master Judge Kelly relied on the wrong type of expert testimony. For example, what Florida does is they kind of dive back into their evidence and all the testimony that they presented in the case to say, look, we've got these folks that were cultivating, harvesting oysters for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And then what happened in 2012 with reduced stream flows, and that it wasn't just over harvesting due to the BP oil spill, that these people who had intimate local knowledge of the Apalachicola River and Bay, like there was a noticeable change in conditions with the kind of prevalence of predators and whatnot in the water. And so Florida is trying to lay out this kind of expert testimony of local knowledge against the experts that Georgia relied on, who were effectively kind of doing desktop surveys of literature reviews and kind of working in kind of more of a outside the region, presenting knowledge and expertise that is again more kind of a desktop based information. Also in April, the seafood workers, the Franklin County Seafood Workers Association, based down in the Apalachicola River and Bay area, they filed what's called a front of the court brief or amicus brief, reiterating many of the same points that are pointed out in Florida's exceptions, kind of about this this argument about what really happened to the oysters. The kind of next steps in this, Georgia will have an opportunity to respond to Florida's exceptions brief, and then Florida will have an opportunity to kind of write one more brief. And then the assumption is that the Supreme Court will take all this whole docket into consideration and place the case on their calendar for 2020 and 2021. The calendar, the court will come back, the court will wrap up its current session in the summer and then come back in the fall of 2020 and run through the summer of 2021. So the assumption is that we will have another court opinion by June and July of 2021. So that's the kind of the legal history, if you will, of the Tri-State Water Wars, which then of course leads to the question of what are the alternatives, and I believe that there are alternatives to lawyers. And so after these kind of 30 some odd years of courtroom battles, residents in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia decided to attempt what no courtroom or governor had been able to do, or maybe had been willing to do. And they wanted to try to resolve the Tri-State Water Wars by sitting down and talking outside of legal context. So the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint stakeholders, the ACFS, was founded in 2009. This is a group of stakeholders of representatives of agricultural, municipal, industrial, environmental, and other sectors from these 3 affected river basins in 3 states. They worked for 6 years to demonstrate that there can be enough water available for all users. Chattahoochee Riverkeeper is a member of the ACF stakeholders. We spend time, we are continuing to meet, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the projects we're continuing to work on. But between 2009 and 2015, the ACFS stakeholders worked on this document here. It's called the Sustainable Water Management Plan. They wanted to put this together to share with state and federal decision makers. And I should step back. When you think about who were members of the stakeholders here, it's probably easier to say, anybody could be a member of the stakeholders except federal and state government representatives. The idea was to try to formulate some sort of consensus driven document like the Sustainable Water Management Plan among the actual stakeholders but not have federal or state level governments involved in the actual crafting of the final plan. But this plan basically offered half a dozen critical recommendations that would improve data collection, improve drought management operations, recommendations that would suggest that the Army Corps of Engineers alter their operations of their 5 dams and reservoirs, and consider adding storage at Lake Lanier and figuring out ways to reduce water withdrawals and maximize water conservation efficiency. And to hold everything together, the Sustainable Water Management Plan also recommended some sort of transboundary water management institution that would facilitate coordination between the 3 states. The idea is that this kind of transboundary water management institution would function like a river basin commission made up of representatives from the 3 states and stakeholders that would be recognized by all state governments involved, and that they would function as kind of a clearinghouse for some operations within the ACF basin. Unfortunately, these recommendations were issued in 2015, and they more or less fall flat because in 2014 the Supreme Court had agreed to hear Florida's challenge to Georgia at the U.S. Supreme Court level. So once that happened in 2014, like none of the state governments wanted to talk about how maybe to resolve this out of the courtroom. So it is worth noting that since 2014, Florida has spent close to $60 million on the water wars that we can document easily. Since 2010, Georgia has spent about 50. The ACF stakeholders, they spent about $1.7 million over 6 years to generate this particular plan. So when you kind of think about it from a cost perspective, putting this Sustainable Water Management Plan together was a heck of a lot cheaper than the Tri-State Water Wars have cost Georgia and Florida over the last few years. So we know water demands are going to continue to increase, and that the cycles of flood and drought are only going to get worse as climate changes. So this underlines the necessity of developing a multi-stakeholder solution that will figure out ways to appropriately share the water and do so in an equitable fashion throughout the 3 states and the 3 river basins. We know there are some other opportunities that exist. There are some steps that we can take in this direction. Certainly the major population center of Georgia being Atlanta, and the agricultural heart of Georgia. We know that these 2 kind of areas of the state are going to need almost half of the state's projected water demand in 2050. So if you look at all the water that all the different regions of the state think they're going to need by 2050, half of that is going to be needed in the Chattahoochee and the Flint River Basin. And of course, these regions are going to need to get their water from a river and a set of rivers and aquifers that are tied up in this major tri-state water conflict. When you throw in climate change, increased temperature, reduced water availability, population growth, there are things that we have to think about to make the Chattahoochee River more sustainable. In the language of today's lawsuit, we have to do everything we can to ensure that Georgia's water use remains reasonable. We need to continue to think differently about how we use water, how we value water, and how we share water. And given those cycles of drought and heavy rain, thankfully we are in one of the wet cycles right now. We also know that the region's next big drought is lurking right around the corner. I wrote the document on the left here called Filling the Water Gap, and the one on the right, Watering Georgia, to basically highlight how we can better conserve water and use it more efficiently in our cities, our homes, our communities, and all of our different industries. In turn, we will be able to advance the sustainability of the Chattahoochee River for the ACF Basin, for Georgia, and for the Southeast. I will be doing another kind of Let's Chat seminar conversation specifically on filling the water gap and water conservation and efficiency. So just kind of keep your ears and eyes out for that. And with that, I am going to, I want to say thanks to everybody for listening and watching today. As I said, this is a part of our Let's Chat series. You can find other editions of Let's Chat on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And as I said again at the top, we are a nonprofit. So if you liked what you heard today or in any of the other Let's Chat series, please consider texting CRK at 41444 to help us keep watch over the Chattahoochee River. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, if anybody wants to share their questions in the chat here on Zoom, or if you want to just unmute yourself and show your video, you can do it that way too. And then if anybody watching on Facebook would post their questions in the comments, I'll relay them to Chris that way as well. And I just want to add that this presentation was recorded, so anybody that signed up via Zoom, we will be sending you an email with a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as any other relevant links, maybe like the filling the water gap report that you mentioned, Chris, and anything else you want to include. And then if anybody on Facebook wants to be included in that email, just feel free to message us your email address and I'll make sure you're added to the list. So do we have any questions at this point? Not seeing any, but Chris, if there's anything else you wanted to add that you weren't able to, now might be a good time.
Well, one thing would be, we also do have summary of kind of where the water wars have been, where they started and whatnot. You can find that on our webpage as well. We can share that link with you. It kind of maybe has a little bit kind of a different level of detail than what I talked about here. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that I think one of our big concerns with the kind of direction of the case is that what we would hate to see is that assuming the U.S. Supreme Court agrees that Florida didn't make a sufficient case, one of our biggest concerns is that folks in Georgia will say, "Hey, sweet, we're done. We won," and we're worried that kind of any efforts that have been made to increase flows in the Chattahoochee and the Flint, efforts on conservation and efficiency in all sectors. Our concern is that if Georgia thinks that there's nothing else that they need to do, that it will be hard for us to keep kind of pushing the needle and being a good example of water stewardship. I mean, I think that Georgia should and can be a leader in the water sector, both utilities on the metropolitan utilities throughout the state, as well as agricultural industries and other water industries. So it's really important that that we continue to think about ways to improve our water use in all sectors.
Yeah, those are some great thoughts, Chris. We did have a few questions come in via Facebook. And I do want to let everybody know that's watching on Facebook, it does seem like there's a little bit of a delay between Zoom and Facebook. So we're a little bit ahead here on Zoom, and then Facebook is probably about 30 seconds behind. So if I said there wasn't any questions, it's just because I hadn't seen yours yet. So one of the questions that came in was from Michael. It says, given that Atlanta is growing and the basin was never intended for such a large population, should we be curbing, how many people, I guess, depend on that water? And he adds, is this a long-term urban planning problem for Atlanta? How should Atlanta be modifying development to accommodate a finite watershed? That's a great question, Michael.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple different things. And again, I think filling the water gap offers some suggestions and ways to move in a direction that will make us more sustainable in our water use. Whether or not communities are going to put some sort of moratorium on growth and development, I don't see that happening in the near term. I think that there are still a lot of ways for us to wring more water out of the water we have, if that makes sense. I think there are ways to enhance our use of water, be it changes in plumbing codes. Those things are still tools that can be deployed and can have real significant impact on water use in everyone's homes. We know we can save millions of gallons of water a day just by changing plumbing codes, enhancing the codes that currently exist today. So I think that's an example of a tool that we can deploy before we would have to ever consider something like a moratorium on building. There also are other ways to potentially increase supply in the basin as well.
Yeah, and I'll add, Chris, having read your Filling the Water Gap report, that report, which again, we'll send a link out and it's available on our website, that report offers so much, background information on some ways that we could save water that I really hadn't considered before. So I'd highly recommend that everybody watching look into that report. We do have another question that came in on Facebook. It's actually from Ashley, who is our Mid-Chat Watershed Protection Specialist. She asks, why aren't the Corps of Engineers more involved? So maybe you could touch on how they're involved currently, what their role is in all of this.
So and I'm assuming, Ashley, that what you mean is, why are they not more involved, more directly in the Florida versus Georgia Supreme Court case? The reason is that it's kind of it's a legal trick. And I should say, here's the disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I just work with really good lawyers who help me understand law. Anyhow, the reason the Corps is not involved is that early on in the case, there was discussion about the Army Corps of Engineers be a party to the case. Florida said no. Florida was like, we don't think the Army Corps of Engineers should be directly involved as a party in the case. Georgia kind of argued that maybe they should. The Corps was, not real interested in being a party to the case. So ultimately, in the very early stages of this litigation, the Corps special master ultimately agreed, like, okay, the Corps won't be a party to the case. So from a legal perspective, very early on, they were kind of put in their own little bubble. And then as far as, I'll say this again. I think that the Corps is in a position where if the Army Corps of Engineers wanted to change how much water they release on a schedule or how much water they retain for water supply, they would have to go back into this document called the Water Control Manual. And the Water Control Manual was revised in 2017, of course, in the middle of the trial. It hadn't been revised since the 1950s when it was first written. And it took years to revise it because it had to go through an environmental impact statement process. It took years of drafting. And so, when you open up a public process like that, anybody can comment, and the Army Corps of Engineers has to take those comments seriously as a part of the National Environmental Protection Act, the NEPA legal standard. And so there are also other kind of federal statutes that control how the Army Corps of Operations functions as a federal bureaucratic agency. That all that together makes it really difficult for the Supreme Court to say, the Army Corps of Engineers, you will release 1,000 extra CFS on Tuesdays. The Supreme Court can't really do that because of all that other administrative and bureaucratic structure that exists around all our federal agencies. And so that's why the Corps is kind of been in a really tricky position of not being able to fully engage, perhaps in a way that would be, I guess, considered more effective.
Chris, we have kind of a follow-up question coming in on Facebook from Michael. Did those revisions you mentioned, did they improve things in your opinion?
Revisions. The revisions to the Water Control Manual, as I'm assuming what Michael's asking about. The Water Control Manual, is supposed to be rewritten, and the water control manual is supposed to set up a set of operations for all the Army Corps of Operations major dams throughout the ACF basin. And they're supposed to look at all the authorized purposes for all the individual structures and kind of balance those different uses. Again, hydropower, navigation, flood control, recreation, and water supply. And so they have to figure out a way to write a document that balances all that. And I would say it's pretty clear that when they rewrote the manual, they seem to put water supply right at the top. Certainly there's not a whole lot of navigation on the Chattahoochee or the Flint or the Apalachicola. There certainly is still hydropower generation, but it's pretty clear that, in the writing of the water control manual, that, water supply got put at the top of the list, and maybe to the detriment of other authorized purposes.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I am not seeing any other questions on Facebook right now. So I think we're good to go ahead and wrap up, unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, I just would invite you to join us on our next Let's Chat series, and I guess I'll pitch my own when I do mine later this month. Hope to see you then.
Yeah, sounds good. And we'll be sending out a link for that webinar within the next few days. Again, for everybody that signed up to watch on Zoom, we'll email you a link. And then if you'd like us to email you a link to that webinar and a recording of this webinar and you're watching on Facebook, please just message us your email address and we'll add you to that list. And Chris will also be available for any additional questions. I'll make sure his information is in that email address. But yeah, reach out if you have any questions, if you have any topics you'd like us to cover on these Let's Chat webinars. We'd definitely be interested in hearing them. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. We hope to talk to you more soon.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.